Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels and welcome to another video. And as always, before we get started today, I'd just like to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subs and thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you all so much, I really appreciate it. And if any of you out there would like to take a couple of extra steps to help support the channel a little bit more, there's a merch store and a Patreon for this channel in the links below. Thank you all so much for all your support. Alright guys, well hey, guess what? The time that you all have been waiting for quite a while has finally come. In today's video, we are finally going to be talking about the sinking of the RMS Lusitania. When we last left the Lusitania, the ship was traveling along the Irish coastline and the ship had just been torpedoed by German U-boat U-20 and the crew was just starting to try to assess the damage that the Lusitania had received by this torpedo attack. And with that out of the way, let's now continue the story of the Lusitania. It is Friday, May 7th, 1915, on board the RMS Lusitania. At exactly 2:10 p.m., a torpedo struck the Lusitania on the starboard side in between the first and second funnel. At the exact moment of impact, 350 pounds worth of explosives located within the torpedo detonated instantly. The resulting explosion exceeded temperatures of 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit or roughly 5,000 degrees Celsius. Now, when you factor in the high temperatures of this explosion, and you also factor in the pressure put on the Lusitania's hull at the site where this torpedo hit the ship, well, the Lusitania's hull was little more than tissue paper against these forces. The resulting explosion immediately breached 2 or more of the Lusitania's 12 watertight compartments, immediately allowing tons of seawater to begin flooding into the Lusitania's hull. Now, just to give you all a better idea into how massive of a hole this torpedo left in the Lusitania's hull below the waterline actually was, well, some estimates think that this hole was roughly the size of a small house. Imagine how much seawater could get into a ship through a hole that big below the waterline. Now, even though most of the damage to the Lusitania was below the waterline, there was some small amounts of damage caused to the Lusitania's upper decks as a result of this torpedo impact as well. You see, at the exact moment that this torpedo struck the Lusitania's hull, it sent a massive geyser of water shooting up higher up than the ship itself. And located within this geyser was all kinds of small bits of debris caused by this torpedo detonation. So you had bits of rope, bits of metal, parts of the torpedo itself, all of the stuff that got blasted off of the ship and the torpedo was sent up into the air with this geyser. Now, because the Lusitania was traveling at roughly 18 knots at the exact moment the torpedo went off, this caused a lot of this debris to rain all around the ship as the Lusitania continued forward through this geyser. And another thing that happened was, lifeboat number 5 on the Lusitania's starboard side, well, this lifeboat was stored on the deck directly above the point that the torpedo detonated. And the resulting detonation basically blasted this lifeboat to atoms. There wasn't a trace of it left on the ship after the torpedo went off. Now, the damage to the Lusitania's hull below the waterline went way further than just this giant hole that we discussed earlier. A lot of the rivets that were located near the site where this torpedo detonated broke loose, which allowed even more water to flood even more spaces of the Lusitania's interior area. And the porthole windows located near the site of detonation, well, all of these porthole windows and the glass within them, well, this glass shattered, which means that once the Lusitania sank so low that these porthole windows went underwater, the water would have even more means to access the ship's interior. Now, in the interior spaces of the ship, well, the damage down below the waterline in these areas was pretty extensive as well. Many of the Lusitania's watertight compartments were damaged by the force of the explosion, and many of the watertight doors located in these compartments were dislodged, which means they couldn't close them properly. So these compartments were no longer watertight. Now, even though we discussed earlier in this video that it's most likely that 2 watertight compartments were directly opened up to the sea by this giant hole in the ship's hull caused by a torpedo impact, I would say that when you factor in all these other variables, I'd say at least 3 watertight compartments were opened up to the sea when this torpedo struck the Lusitania's hull. Now, immediately following the torpedo impact, the ship began to take on a very sharp list to starboard. This list happened so quickly that the crew of the Lusitania really didn't have any time to react to it at all. They were still trying to recover from what had just happened with the torpedo, and now immediately following that, the ship starts listing. But within 10 seconds of the torpedo striking the Lusitania's hull, the Lusitania started leaning to her starboard side. The ship stabilized with a list of 15 degrees to starboard. That right there should tell you how much water was now flooding inside of the Lusitania immediately following the torpedo detonation. Now, the reason why the Lusitania took this sharp list to starboard so soon after the torpedo detonation was because of the Lusitania's longitudinal bulkheads. And in case you don't remember what a longitudinal bulkhead is, I'll explain. You see, the interior spaces of the Lusitania were separated by 12 individual watertight compartments. And of these 12 watertight compartments, any 2 could be breached and the ship would not sink. But when they were building the Lusitania, they decided to add another safety feature to the ship. And what these safety features were called were longitudinal bulkheads, which means that there were additional watertight bulkheads placed along the inner hull of the Lusitania. And what they also decided to do with these bulkheads built along the inner hull was use them as coal bunkers. So what ended up happening was, when the torpedo struck the Lusitania on the starboard side and damaged those longitudinal bulkheads, even though these bulkheads weren't watertight anymore, when the torpedo hit it, the water still filled up these bulkheads first before it spilled into the rest of the interior spaces of the ship. But as that water rapidly flooded those longitudinal bulkheads along the ship's starboard side, the weight of the water in those bulkheads dragged the ship over to her starboard side. This is why the Lusitania developed such a sharp list to starboard so soon after the torpedo detonation. And if you thought things couldn't get any worse for the Lusitania so soon after the torpedo detonation, remember it's only been 10 seconds ship time since the torpedo went off. Well, guess what? They could. You see, as the Lusitania took on this very sharp list to starboard, a good number of the porthole windows on the Lusitania's starboard side went underwater almost instantly. And the reason why this was such a big problem for the ship was because it was such a nice day outside, and a good number of the Lusitania's passengers had opened up the porthole windows in their staterooms before leaving their cabins for the day. And what you need to remember is, every single porthole window that was left open on the ship, well, as soon as it dipped beneath the surface, each window could let in an estimated 3 tons of seawater per minute. Now, I'm not sure how accurate this is, but some estimates believe that there could have been as many as 70 open porthole windows on the ship's starboard side that went underwater almost instantly following the torpedo detonation. So when you factor in that many windows open, and then you times that by 3 tons of seawater per minute, just think about how much water was flooding the Lusitania's interior so soon after the torpedo detonation. So, needless to say, the Lusitania very quickly hit the maximum amount of flooding the ship could take within her interior and not sink, and quickly surpassed it. So, in less than a minute following the torpedo detonation, the Lusitania exceeded her maximum flooding limit, and there was nothing that Captain Turner or anybody on the ship could do to keep the ship from sinking. At the time of the torpedo detonation, Captain Turner wasn't on the bridge. He was actually heading to his stateroom at that time to retrieve something in his cabin. He was standing just outside his stateroom door when the torpedo exploded against the Lusitania's hull. As soon as he felt the explosion, he immediately turned around and began heading for the bridge. He was actually climbing up a flight of stairs when the Lusitania took this very sharp list to starboard. And the process of the ship rolling over to her starboard side was so sudden and quick that Captain Turner basically had to brace himself in this stairway to keep himself from falling. Once the ship stabilized with its 15-degree list to starboard, Captain Turner began to head to the bridge once again. And then, as he was proceeding towards the bridge, something else happened to the ship that Captain Turner could not believe. Around 15 seconds after the torpedo had struck the Lusitania's hull, Captain Turner was still racing to the bridge when the unthinkable happened. Captain Turner said that he heard and felt a second massive explosion echo throughout the ship. Now, the funny thing about this explosion was there was nothing visible on the outside of the Lusitania to signal where this explosion came from, which could only mean one thing, that something inside the Lusitania had just exploded. The source of this secondary explosion is a highly debated topic even to this day. Many people believed for a very long time, and I count myself among them, that they thought that it was the small arms munitions that the Lusitania was carrying in her cargo hold that exploded. However, they did many dives to the wreck of the Lusitania to try to figure out what the cause of this secondary explosion was, and they discovered that the cargo hold where these munitions were kept was completely intact, so it was not the small arms munitions that exploded. So with this evidence in mind, and with everything that I have been researching over the past couple of weeks, I tend to lean more towards that it was probably a steam line or a boiler explosion that caused this massive secondary explosion. And the reason I think this was because not long after the Lusitania experienced this secondary explosion, the ship lost nearly all steam pressure in her engines. And if it was a steam line or a boiler explosion that caused the secondary explosion, then this makes sense. The ship would lose almost all of its steam pressure if something like that exploded. But I'll get more into that in a few minutes. But yeah, for now, that is my theory on what caused the secondary explosion. But we will never be able to say with absolute certainty what caused this secondary explosion. Captain Turner entered the Lusitania's bridge shortly after this second massive explosion was heard and felt all throughout the ship. Upon entering the bridge, Captain Turner's first order was to try to stop the ship as quickly as possible. He wanted to do this by throwing the Lusitania's engines into reverse, because by doing it this way, he would be able to stop the ship much more quickly than if he simply just shut off the Lusitania's engines and let the Lusitania coast to a stop. Now, the engine room did receive Captain Turner's order to throw the Lusitania's engines into reverse. However, when they received this order, they sent word back to the bridge that steam pressure within the Lusitania's engines had dropped from 195 psi down to only 50 psi. And with such a low amount of pressure in the system, the Lusitania's engines did not respond. The Lusitania's engines were now dead, so that means that the only way that Captain Turner had to stop the ship was to slowly but surely let her drift to a halt. Now, the issue of not being able to stop the Lusitania presented two real problems to Captain Turner. Number one, he could not launch any of the Lusitania's lifeboats until the vessel had slowed down quite a bit. And the reason being was, if you tried to launch a lifeboat while a vessel like the Lusitania is still moving forward at 18 knots, well, the second this lifeboat touches the water, the forward momentum of the ship could rip the lifeboat apart. Or at the very least, it would spill all the occupants in that lifeboat into the sea. So he had to wait until the Lusitania stopped before he could attempt to launch the lifeboats, or at the very least wait for the ship to slow down a bit. Now, he could go ahead and start the preparation process for the boats. He just couldn't lower them at this time. And the second issue that Captain Turner had to deal with due to the Lusitania's forward momentum was with the ship moving forward at this time, well, it put a lot more water pressure on the damaged sections of the Lusitania that were now below the waterline. They use a term called forced flooding to describe this effect. If there's a damaged compartment below the waterline, then the increased pressure on that area due to the forward momentum of the ship would force more water into a vessel's hull than if the vessel was sitting still in the water. There are some estimates that believe that due to the Lusitania's forward momentum of 18 knots at this time, that as much as 100 tons of seawater was entering the Lusitania through its damaged compartments below the waterline. So, as you can see, the Lusitania was taking on water fast, and Captain Turner was in an incredibly desperate situation. When Captain Turner realized that he wasn't going to be able to stop the Lusitania, what he decided to do next was to attempt to steer the Lusitania towards the Irish shoreline. His hope was that if he couldn't stop the ship, he may be able to beach the ship on Ireland's coastline. He ordered the helmsman to turn the Lusitania to port. The helmsman did this, and the ship responded. He waited until the Lusitania's bow was evenly lined up with Ireland's shoreline. Then he told the helmsman to even the ship out and keep the Lusitania pointed at a lighthouse at the old head of Kinsale, which was a location directly in front of the Lusitania on Ireland's coastline. However, when the helmsman attempted to even the ship out, the Lusitania did not respond. At this time, the Lusitania's helm was now dead. All Captain Turner and the bridge crew could do was watch helplessly as the Lusitania's bow slowly turned away from Ireland, and the ship began once again to head further out to sea. It has now been 2 minutes since Torpedo detonation. Upon realizing the helm of the Lusitania was dead, Captain Turner realized that his ship was in serious trouble. At this time, he ordered a call for help to be sent out, and he also ordered to have all of the Lusitania's watertight doors closed. A good number of the watertight doors on the Lusitania were automatic. They could simply close these doors by throwing some switches on the bridge. And he also ordered to have the lifeboats of the Lusitania prepped, but he also told the crew to not launch the lifeboats yet because the ship was moving too fast to launch the boats. Just get them ready to be launched. That's all he told them to do. Now, given how much everything had already gone wrong with the Lusitania so soon after the torpedo impact, Captain Turner was concerned that the watertight doors, or the automatic ones anyway, wouldn't be able to close properly. So he ordered one member of his bridge crew to go down below and check to make sure that the watertight doors were closed. This crewman never returned. It has been 3 minutes since torpedo detonation, and most of the passengers and crew on board the Lusitania now know that their ship is in serious trouble. Inside the Lusitania, people are running every which way to try to make their way up to the upper decks. Now, most of the people inside the Lusitania decide to use the ship's stairways in order to make their way up to the boat deck. However, not all do this. A good number of the people inside the Lusitania choose to try to make their way up to the boat deck by taking the Lusitania's elevator system. However, what the people who took the elevators inside the Lusitania don't yet realize is that another one of the Lusitania's critical systems is about to fail. Just 4 minutes after the Lusitania was struck by the torpedo, there was no longer enough steam pressure within the Lusitania's systems to power the Lusitania's dynamos. And as a result of this, all of the Lusitania's electricity now failed, and the ship was plunged into total darkness. Now, what you have to remember is, despite the fact that it's the middle of the afternoon as the Lusitania is currently sinking, if you were in an area of the ship that didn't have any windows or portholes or anything like that, well, these parts of the ship, when the power failed, were plunged into total darkness. So can you imagine trying to escape the interior of the Lusitania in pitch black? I mean, you couldn't see anything. I mean, I can't even imagine how terrifying this must have been. But if you think that was terrifying, well, for the passengers who were trying to escape the Lusitania by taking the ship's elevators up to the boat deck, well, they faced a whole other kind of horror. You see, there was one elevator on the Lusitania that was on its way up to the boat deck when the power failed, and when the power went out, this elevator became trapped in between floors, and the people within this elevator, they were stuck. There was nothing they could do. People who escaped the Lusitania said that they could hear screaming coming from inside the walls as the people who were in this elevator tried desperately to get out. But unfortunately, nothing could be done for these people trapped in the elevator. The Lusitania was sinking way too fast. Now, despite the fact that the Lusitania's power had by this point completely failed, the ship was still able to send out a distress call by means of the Marconi Wireless's emergency battery backup system. Now, by this point, a good number of ships had picked up the Lusitania's distress call and were beginning to head towards the ship. The distress call of the Lusitania was also picked up in Ireland, and Ireland's government was already beginning to send a distress call over to England and to the British Admiralty's base in London. So, slowly but surely, the entire world was starting to realize that something very serious had just happened with the RMS Lusitania. Right around the time that all of the Lusitania's power went out, there were already a good number of passengers up on the Lusitania's boat deck waiting to be put into one of the ship's lifeboats. Now, the first boat that looked like it was about to be launched was lifeboat number 2, which was the first boat on the Lusitania's portside boat deck, right beside the bridge. There were a good number of passengers already climbing into this boat, and they were wanting to be lowered away. However, what these people didn't realize was that a great tragedy was about to happen at lifeboat number 2. Now, before I tell you about the horrible tragedy that unfolded at lifeboat number 2 on the Lusitania, I first need to give you a little bit of a lesson in how these lifeboats are prepped and launched. Because if I don't tell you all this, you won't fully understand why what happened at lifeboat number 2 happened at all. You see, if a ship like the Lusitania isn't sinking, and the lifeboats are just simply secured on the ship's deck, they use a series of chains to hold the lifeboat on the deck, so if the ship encounters rough seas and all that and is rocking around, these lifeboats don't slide all over the place. So if they want to launch some lifeboats, the first thing they have to do is break these chains free. And then at this point, the lifeboat is just sitting on the deck through the power of gravity. You know, it's just resting there. And this lifeboat could slide around if the situation allowed it to. And then once these chains are free, the crew then use ropes that are secured to the Lusitania's davits, and then they hoist the lifeboat up, and they pull it out over the side, and then lower it over the ship's side using the davits and the ropes and so on and so forth. Now, with the Lusitania, remember, the ship is currently listing pretty heavily to starboard. And at lifeboat number 2, there are passengers there panicking and climbing into the boat and all that stuff. Now, the officer in charge of lowering lifeboat number 2 was trying to keep order at this location, and he was trying to tell all the passengers, hey, we can't lower this lifeboat, because number 1, the ship is still moving way too fast, and number 2, the ship is listing too far to the starboard side. So if we free this lifeboat, we're not going to be able to get the lifeboat over the side of the ship. It's just going to slide back down onto the deck if it's freed. And right as he was saying this to these passengers, he heard the sound of a hammer hit a chain. And in order to break these chains free and have the boat sit naturally on its own, you have to hammer down on a release pin, and this would break the chain. This officer, he heard a crewman whacking the release chain. and he knew in his head what was about to happen. This officer turned and looked at the crewman, and he said he literally saw the hammer in the guy's hand up in the air about to hit the chain. And before the word no could leave this officer's lips, he hit the chain and the chain snapped free. As soon as this happened, because the Lusitania is very heavy lift to starboard, this lifeboat slid free, came crashing down onto the deck, and crushed several people against the Lusitania's superstructure. And then, because by this point the Lusitania was down pretty far at the head as well, the lifeboat began to slide forward, injuring and killing countless more people as it headed for the bridge. Now, the lifeboat eventually came to rest right underneath the port side bridge wing, right around here where my finger is. And Captain Turner was on the port side bridge wing when this went down, and he saw everything happen. I mean, I can't even put into words how disastrous this was. I mean, remember, this was the first lifeboat that was about to be prepped. And honestly, it was a bad omen for the things that were about to happen on board the Lusitania. All right, everybody. Well, hey, I hate to do this to all of you, but I think this is the spot where we're going to have to pause the Lusitania timeline series for now. I was really hoping to be able to tell the entire story of the sinking of the Lusitania in this one video, but basically, we've only covered 5 minutes of the sinking of the Lusitania, and this video is already over 20 minutes long. And remember, it took the Lusitania 18 minutes to go down, so there's still a lot more to cover, so I need to do another video. Anyway, guys, hey, thank you all so much for your understanding. Thank you all so much for all your support, and be sure you join me in the next episode when we finish talking about the sinking of the Lusitania. Y'all take care out there, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day, everybody. Special thanks to our captain level Patreon supporter, Dakota Charbonneau. Thank you so much for all the support, man.